Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the last session of our Latin American History Seminar this term. And it certainly gives me a great pleasure to introduce Peter Guardino and Timo Schaefer, our guest speakers. Before I introduce them properly, I just want to say a couple of words on our seminar, just for those of you who are joining us for the first time. The Latin American History Seminar was launched in October 2013, and since then we've been meeting every Thursday of the week during the term throughout the academic year. And this term has been really wonderful. We have had a series of excellent talks, opening with Alan Knight on informal empire and internal colonialism from 1810 to 1930. And we have had talks from Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Mexico, conceptual history. And last week we had a talk on Venezuela. And from the start of the pandemic, we started to experiment with this format of tertulias, where authors of book are invited to speak about their work, either work recently published, work in progress, or work published recently or a long time ago. And in this particular case, it's a recent book that we are going to talk about today on the Mexican-American War, 1846 and 48. And it's a great, great pleasure to introduce both our speakers today. Peter Guardino is Provost Professor at Indiana University, and he has published two wonderful books, at least, on Mexican liberalism, peasant politics, and the formation of Mexico's national state, Guerrero, 1800 and 1857, and the time of liberty, popular political culture in Oaxaca from 1750 to 1850, and these books on popular liberalism in Mexico and state formation and peasants are key books for those working on these topics. More recently, he has published The Dead March, A History of the Mexican-American War, which will be the topic of the conversation today. The latter won the Conference on Latin American History's Bolton Johnson Award for the best book on Latin American history, the Society for Military History's Distinguished Book Award for the best book of non-US states military history, and the Western History Association Robert Attlee Award for the best book on frontier military history. So this is a book that has been already highlighted as a landmark in the historiography. These books have been translated and published in Mexico. And Professor Guardino has received a number of prestigious fellowships, including 3 Fulbright Awards and fellowships from the American Council of Learning Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Social Science Research Council. And we feel very privileged to have Peter Guardino with us today. He will be talking about his book with Timo Schaefer, a colleague, postdoctoral fellow in the Contemporary History and Public Policy of Mexico here at Oxford. And his first book, Liberalism as Utopia, The Rise and Fall of Legal Rule in Post-Colonial Mexico, 1820-1900, was published by Cambridge University Press, and again received the Social Science Best Book Award from the Latin American Studies Association, the Mexico section. And he has published some articles on journals on the history of Mexico. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Timo and Peter, and now the floor is yours, Timo, to yours, and welcome, and many thanks for being with us today, and welcome everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Eduardo, for the introduction. It's of course a wonderful pleasure to me also to be here and to be able to talk to Peter about his recent book. Full disclosure, Peter was my PhD supervisor when I was a PhD student at Indiana University. So I will leave it to you, the audience, to ask the really, really hard and challenging questions in the Q&A afterwards. I will ask perhaps less challenging questions. I will ask questions that really invite Peter to talk about and introduce his book to the audience. I wanted to say a few things about Peter's work at the start, though, because it seems to me that this book, The Dead March, is quite a departure for you, Peter, in comparison to your previous work. In your previous work, you've written about subjects that superficially might seem obscure or marginal to people, right? You've written about indigenous peasants in Guerrero and their political culture, or Afro sharecroppers in the Tierra Caliente in Guerrero. You've written about indigenous peasants in Oaxaca. You've written about artisans and plebeians in Oaxaca City. And a lot of the force of your arguments, of the arguments that you made in your previous work, actually came from the fact that you were able to show that, that these people were actually not at all marginal to Mexican history, right? You wrote about these people not just as a sort of gesture towards inclusivity to say, okay, let's give some space to these people, but you actually wrote about them to show that without understanding their life worlds, their imaginaries, their values, we would not be able to really understand what happened in Mexico before, during, and after the wars of independence. So you took seemingly obscure topics and you made them central to the understandings of Mexican history. Now, in this new book, you've taken a topic that couldn't be more familiar to the sort of like most traditional historian, military history, right? That is sort of like the kind of history, you know, that's how history started. It's still one of the sort of best-selling genres in history. You find it in bookstores. You find it less in university bookstores. It's a little bit less common for academic historians to write about military history. Now, if there's a military history buff who looks at your book and sort of browses through it, that history buff will certainly be sort of reassured that this is the kind of book that they're expecting. In other words, it's a book that starts with the outbreak of the war, and it talks about campaigns, it talks about battles, right? It talks about first the campaign in northern Mexico, led by US General Zachary Taylor, leading to the occupation by parts of the US Army of northern Mexico. And then you talk about the campaign later on in the war of General Winfield Scott, landing troops in Veracruz, moving, much like the conquistadors had done, 400 years earlier, moving towards Mexico City, occupying Mexico City, and forcing Mexico basically to surrender and to give up. This is, of course, the great outcome of the war that we all know about, to give up and what is about half of Mexican territory. So a very different book from your previous books. What made you want to write a military history?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me thank you, first of all, Eduardo and Timo, for inviting me to be here with you, and to thank all of you for lending us your attention. I can't see all the names on the screen, but I see a lot of old friends here and other people whose work has been influential on my own work, even though I haven't had a chance to meet them, even virtually like this. So first of all, let me thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invitation. I didn't really set out to write military history when I wrote this book. And in fact, I remember sending a message to an old colleague from my undergraduate days and mentioning to him, oh, I'm going to write this book about the Mexican-American War, but it's not really going to be military history. And then I explained to him that this was going to be a sort of social and cultural history of the war that foregrounded the experiences of exactly the kind of people that Timo just mentioned. I mean, relatively poor, people seen as pretty marginal to history, and that it would do that actually not only for the Mexicans, but also for the Americans. And this friend, whose name is Michael Lotus, he's a lawyer now, immediately told me, oh no, you're writing military history. There's this whole trend in military history called the new military history that does that. It's give me some things to read. And one of the stories of this book is that I kept getting more things to read from colleagues all over the place, Latin Americanists, like most of you are, Americanists, et cetera. I felt like I was in graduate school again in terms of preparing myself to write this book. But what became clear to me, I mean, in a lot of ways, this is a book about that follows in the same sort of moral, I don't want to call it a tradition, but the same trend of my previous two books, in the sense that it's about people that others, we typically don't think of as being central to large political events, really being central to large political events. Because it turns out, and this will probably doesn't surprise you that much, although at times it does surprise some people, that cannon fodder comes from somewhere, right? That in a lot of ways, wars are places where people with a lot of different motivations and a lot of different connections to institutions come together to try to kill each other, which is a very pessimistic way of putting this. So what I did find is that in order to write this book, I had to not only understand what new military historians were doing and understand what U.S. historians, social and political historians were doing, and what Mexicanists were doing, and the other Latin Americans were doing. I had to actually go and write and understand traditional military history. I actually had to learn things about how generals expected battles to play out and how they were trained, and what were the sort of constraints on their actions. And that was actually another, almost like going to grad school, like I said again. But the answer, Timo, is I really didn't set out to write military history.
Right. Okay. Which is, I think, how many books get written, right? You start off with an idea or with a topic, and then it sort of like leads you in new directions, and you end up writing military history and, painting little battle maps that show the position of opposing artillery and infantry battalions. So the Mexican-American War took place between 1846 and 1848. And one of the topics that you highlight in this book is that, that war is very costly in human lives, that it's a tragedy, right? Many people die. And this is, of course, not a surprise to us. And it wasn't a surprise to Mexicans and Americans in the 19th century either. So why did Mexico and the United States go to war, being fully aware of the human cost that war entails?
Well, I think at the beginning, neither side was fully aware of how high the human cost was going to be. Polk, the American president, he basically thought he could intimidate Mexico into giving him territory. And that was the basic idea. And then he expected Mexico to fold after a couple of battles in the north. He completely underestimated the degree to which Mexico was actually, Mexican politicians in particular would be unwilling to give him that territory, and that Mexicans from many walks of life would be willing to sort of back this effort to stand up to the United States. On the Mexican side, many of them thought, again, this would be a relatively short war. The United States did not have a strong military reputation in 1846. The major war before that had been the War of 1812, as we call it in the United States, which was a minor brush fire on the margins of the Napoleonic conflicts, in which the people from Great Britain pretty much won. Right? We did not really fulfill any of our war aims. The United States did not fulfill practically any of its war aims in the War of 1812. So from the Mexican point of view, we didn't seem to be that strong a contender. So in that sense, I mean, people don't always know how things are going to turn out, and if the scale of the tragedy had been very clear at the beginning of the war in April 1846, maybe somebody would have pulled back.
Right. I think you say the United States went to war because Polk basically wanted, territories that belonged to Mexico, and he did gain those territories in the end. And maybe the idea that Polk had and that U.S. Americans had at the time was that these were territories that Mexico was less interested in than the United States, because at the time, settlers from the United States were sort of like starting to pour into these territories. This had, of course, started with Texas, whereas Mexicans seemed more content to stay in the sort of Mexican heartland, and did not seem to be in a great rush to sort of move north and really sort of start expanding the traditional area of settlement and agriculture. Is that sort of a correct assessment?
So here, environmental history comes into it. Okay, Mexico's, the long march to the north that began with the fall of Tenochtitlan, and continued, sporadically over the centuries. They was a march into very arid territories where agriculture was very difficult. And in most cases, the impetus for that march was the discovery of precious metals. Okay, almost every move north from 1520 on, it's the discovery of precious metals that makes that happen, right? And it was just simply not possible to really make a living other ways in this vast territory that became most of the Western U.S. eventually, right? And most of northern Mexico. Americans believed that agriculture was a possibility in a lot of this territory because in eastern Texas it was, and they had, managed to rip eastern Texas away from Mexico, and in California it was. But that was really the only places where it was possible. One of the funny things about this war is the United States gained all this territory that later became valuable because of mineral strikes, but it wasn't the minerals they were after when they fought the war. So if, for instance, the gold that was discovered in California in 1849 had been discovered 20 years earlier, Mexicans would have populated that territory. The same is true of the minerals that were in Arizona and New Mexico and places like that. So the Americans were engaged in this long, mostly long westward expansion, mostly motivated by the desire for new agricultural territory. They were actually hitting the environmental limits of that, but they didn't realize it. I don't know if that quite makes sense. So sometimes the war is a sort of accident.
Right. No, that makes sense. And so you talk about this, you write about this war, and you use it in part as a pretext, not just as a pretext, but you use it as an occasion to also engage in a comparative history of the politics and societies of Mexico and the United States in the 1840s. And you point out in the introduction that at least implicit in traditional accounts of the war is actually always a comparison between Mexico and the United States. And the comparison usually sort of states that, that the reason that the United States won the war is that Mexicans did not have the same level of nationalism or national sort of identity, patriotism that their US counterparts displayed, right? I was just looking yesterday at the other book that I have in my shelf that is about the Mexican-American War. It's a book that didn't come out too long ago, but in that book, for instance, it is stated that it is suggested that in the 1840s, perhaps 3/4 of Mexico's indigenous population had in the 1840s not yet found out that Mexico had become independent from Spain, right? So this is a very common idea that in Mexico, society was sort of like multiracial. It was divided by experiences, by interests that made it very hard for people to come together in a common war effort. And it was much easier in the US because in the US, politics was much more sort of like organized around a racial ideal. So, white people were US citizens. And that made US society, at least the part of the society that was included in the polity, much more cohesive. And what are your findings about this comparison between US American and Mexican societies in the 1840s?
So before I answer that directly, I want to speak a little bit to the question of comparison, because intellectually, this is one of the forces that really drove me toward this topic. I had been, over a period of years, I'd become increasingly, come to increasingly believe that much of what we write about Latin America is implicitly comparative, okay? And that mostly, there's a problem with that. And the problem is that implicit comparisons tend to be sloppy comparisons. Okay. And then both historians in Latin America and historians outside Latin America writing about Latin America, we tended, because this tradition was laid down actually beginning in the 19th century, we've tended to compare Latin American institutions with institutions in Europe, the United States, and not do it very well, in the sense of we exaggerated the success of institutions in the United States and Europe. We exaggerated their failures in Latin America. And that's one of the things that really drove me to write this book. Okay? And so this question about why the US won is also an implicitly comparative one. So rather than talk about what Mexico was like, I'm going to start by talking about what the United States was like. This United States that this unnamed author that Timo is protecting his name from me, I think I know who it is, who suggested that the US won this war because the US basically had its political act together and was much more unified, is actually talking about the United States, which is on the verge of the United States Civil War, which is going to kill nearly 1 million people, kill the equivalent casualties for a civil war of that scale in the United States today would kill like 7 million people. A war that would not end in a compromise, would end when one society could no longer resist anymore. One of the sides could no longer resist anymore. How unified was the United States in 1861? How unified was the United States in 1846? It's a different kettle of fish. Okay, it's not what this person believes. Okay, and on the other side, okay, the notion that 75% of Mexico's population were indigenous people who did not know Mexico was independent is just flatly wrong. Okay, and we can prove that in many, many ways. Now, what they believed about Mexican politics is another issue entirely, and a much more complicated issue. Yeah. And so one of the things that I found as I went through this is that Mexico didn't lack institutions that could organize armies. There were many Mexicans of many walks of life who spoke about being Mexicans and under the pressure of this war. And certainly they had many different ideas about what Mexico was like when they were fighting in this war, but they were talking about Mexico and they were making sacrifices of blood, sacrifices of wealth also, right? But the big reason the United States won the war had to do with the fact that the United States economy had become extremely successful in the years from the United States independence until the 1840s. And the United States had enormous quantities of resources that Mexico did not have.
And I think that's an important point, right? To point out, okay, the United States won the war because it was much richer than Mexico at the time. What made the United States so much more prosperous than Mexico in the 1840s?
So there are two sets of reasons. One set has to do with institutions, basically because of this legacy from Great Britain, we had legal institutions that really facilitated capitalism in ways that Mexico did not. Okay, or facilitated capitalist economic growth in ways Mexico did not. Especially, it was relatively easy to collect debts under the laws. It was relatively difficult. It was difficult to legally delay paying your debts. Okay, and that made a big difference. But I'm convinced at this point in my life, and I wouldn't have said this 30 years ago, that a lot of this had to do with happy geographic accident. If you look at the United States, the way it was in 1846, there's almost no land which doesn't get sufficient yearly rainfall that you could do agriculture with staple crops. There's very little land that's not accessible to water transportation, either through the vast river systems of the United States, not only the Mississippi and its tributaries, but also many rivers that penetrate from the East Coast, or from just being on the coast in the first place. So this means when the Industrial Revolution is taking off in Great Britain and in France, a little before it does in the United States is perfectly positioned to take advantage of that. We can sell wheat, we can sell cotton in very massive quantities. Mexico has none of those advantages. There are very few rivers in Mexico, even to this day, are navigable for any serious length of time. The geography just doesn't facilitate that. And Mexico's land is much more arid. And even when you get the seasonal rains to support agriculture, are very seasonal also means that, that the rivers are not going to be navigable because there's only water in the rivers for a certain amount of time every year. So the United States had enormous economic advantages that a lot of people in the United States today would say, oh yeah, we worked really hard and we were smarter. And it doesn't come down to that. It really doesn't come down to that.
So how did these economic advantages that the United States had, how did these play out concretely during the war? And maybe you can give an example or two from some of the battles that Mexico and the United States fought during the war.
So it played out militarily in two ways. First of all, in terms of equipment, most of Mexico's equipment, especially the muskets, were already, they were bought used and they were already worn out. In fact, they were mostly bought from British financiers who were selling them muskets that had been used during the Napoleonic Wars. Okay. And Brian DeLay is writing a great book about the arms trade in the Americas, which this is one of the things that goes on in that book. What this meant was that when you started shooting these muskets, they broke. Okay, that was a big problem in a battle. But in the everyday experience of the people fighting the war in Mexico, it played out in terms of starvation more than anything else, deprivation. Okay, the Mexican government rarely had the fiscal resources needed to feed people. Okay, and this is one of the things that really becomes clear when you start reading about this war, is that the social history of this war from the Mexican point of view is a history of hunger. So Timo suggested I talk about a particular battle. So one battle, a battle that the Mexicans almost won, is a battle that Americans call Buena Vista and Mexicans call La Angostura. It took place just south of Saltillo, which is in Coahuila, in February of 1847. And this deprivation plays out in this battle because the battle itself, first of all, would never have happened if Mexico had been able to actually support its armies properly. What happens is that Santa Anna, the most famous character in this war, builds a very large Mexican army in San Luis Potosí, thinking the Americans are going to keep advancing from the north. He realizes they're not going to, and they're going to instead invade through Veracruz, as Timo pointed out a little while ago. And at the same time, he's running out of money to feed his army. And what he decides to do is to march them across the desert to try to get at the Americans that are still in the Saltillo area and have a relatively quick victory there. Okay. He knows this is very difficult. And the soldiers know this is very difficult. And they're already hungry before they set out across the desert. And he literally gives them a speech in which he says, hey, here's the deal. We're going to go take resources from the enemy. I know you can do this. I know you're tough enough to do this. We've never relied on anything but your toughness. We're going to go and take what they have. And this is how he gets these people across the desert, which takes them about 3 weeks. Okay. That means when they're actually fighting the battle, they're famished. The survivors who get there are absolutely famished. And when he eventually breaks off the battle, it's not after 3 days of fighting. It's not because he doesn't think he's winning. It's because he thinks the army is about to dissolve because these people have still not had anything to eat. And they're going to go off and look for food. This is what hungry people do. Okay. And he says, I've got to preserve the army. I'm going to pull them back to where I have a little bit of food. And then maybe we'll be able to go back and battle the day after that. And when he pulls them back, he realizes, oh my God, we don't even have enough food for that. We have to leave. So the whole battle would never have existed, without this problem of deprivation, of the lack of resources. And that's how everyday Mexicans experience this war for the most part, through hunger.
Right. And I would say that to me, that's one of the sort of tragic high points of the book is your description of the Battle of La Angostura or Buena Vista, which is unexpected for me because I never thought that the description of a battle would be a high point in a book for me. But it's of course in part because you talk about battle history and about the position of troops and things like that, but you also talk about you talk about the sort of the human and the social and the cultural background of the battles. Now, we've talked so far a lot about differences between the United States and Mexico, right? Why did the United States actually end up winning the war? But you also make a case in your book for a lot of similarities between the Mexican and the American armies and the soldiers who went to war in the 1840s. So could you talk a little bit about who were the soldiers who fought on the Mexican on the American fight sides, and also why did they fight, right? Because we, if we've read Tolstoy, we sort of have this idea that soldiers do not simply go to war because they're sort of like puppets that are being manipulated by big generals like Napoleon from the top, but that is not a sort of convincing explanation of why war happens. There must be other things motivating or driving the soldiers. So who were these soldiers, and why did they go to war?
So on each side, there's basically two very different kinds of soldiers. And this makes things a little bit complicated. Soldiers that had entered both armies before the war were mostly soldiers in what they call the permanent army in Mexico and the regular army in the United States. On the US side, they were mostly people who were too poor to make a living, even in this relatively prosperous United States. They faced very poor prospects, and they signed up because they would get a roof over their heads and 3 square meals a day. Many of them were immigrants, especially Irish and German immigrants. There actually were a lot of British immigrants also in the United States regular army. Okay. On the Mexican side, the army couldn't even provide them that. Okay, and so this meant that the Mexican permanent army had to actually draft soldiers, had to conscript soldiers. And generally speaking, what it did is it sent, the central government sent quotas to the states sent quotas to localities, and the localities, local officials, often with sort of committees of people who were considered to be honorable men, would pick out who was going to actually go into the army. Their criteria were to try to protect local society as much as possible. And what that really meant was they tended to try to pick men who were not fulfilling their gendered responsibilities. Pick the people who are not supporting their wife and children, not supporting their aged parents, the ne'er-do-wells, the bums. Okay, and that was what they mostly tried to do. Of course, once the war started, you quickly ran out of ne'er-do-wells and bums. And you had to expand your criteria. And a lot of people who actually did support their families and were hard workers did end up in the Mexican permanent army during the war. In both cases, you could think of, well, gee, from the point of view of military manpower, this is not so good. These people are not really very highly motivated, right? And they're not the best people. But the answer was, in the military culture of the day in the Western world, from Russia all the way to Tierra del Fuego, this was actually very common. This problem was actually very common, and they had ways to beat it. And they beat it with very fierce discipline during training, and by keeping men together so they developed bonds of comradeship. Okay, so they didn't care where the cannon fodder came from. They knew they could use it. Now, in both countries, there's a different kind of soldier. In Mexico, there are National Guardsmen who are family men, respectable providers, et cetera, but during the war, they sign up to defend Mexico. And they're more ideologically motivated, generally speaking. They're not as well trained. This is a problem. It can be difficult to deploy them because when you decide you're going to deploy your National Guards people, it means that you're going to take them away from their families and they'll no longer be able to support their families, which is a huge social issue, which actually keeps them home oftentimes. But they're definitely more ideologically motivated. They're so ideologically motivated that in Mexico, there are National Guard units that are relatively federalist, National Guard units that are relatively centralist. There are units that are moderate federalists, and sometimes they come to blows with each other, especially during the so-called rebellion of the Pocos. Okay. On the US side, there's also people who volunteered for the war. They're volunteers who sign up, who are also very ideologically motivated. They're the people who really believe Mexicans are racially inferior. And they're the people who really believe in manifest destiny, this notion of an expansionist United States. Okay. And they also sign up for the war, and they also turn out to be not very well trained and relatively poorly disciplined. It's actually pretty bad for military units when you elect your own officers, because the people you elect are not going to actually keep you to high standards. So there's basically four different kinds of soldiers that come together in this huge tragedy, all different sets of motivations. But you could say that in some ways the volunteers on the U.S. side are actually very congruent with the National Guard on the Mexican side, and the two regular armies are actually very, very congruent with each other.
And in the end, who make the better soldiers? Who are more important for the outcome of the war? Are they the sort of like, what we think of maybe as the more modern sort of citizen soldiers, right? The citizens who are actually motivated by patriotism? Or are they what we might think of as the more early modern mercenaries who enter the army either because, either as conscripts or simply because that's their way to earn their bread and butter?
I think most officers at the time would have preferred the mercenary, the regular armies. And in fact, they wrote about this all of the time. If you look at it from the point of view of their performance in battle, the American volunteers were clearly the worst by far. Mexican National Guardsmen actually did tend to perform pretty well in battle, not always, but most of the time. It's not like running a football team, right? You don't really get to choose when you're an officer and you go into battle with the people that you have. And so from them, that was a sort of a moot point.
Right. What made this is an interesting point that you say that the US volunteers may actually have been, the people who performed worst in battle. And again, we might sort of like expect, with a background, with a modern background and thinking about the citizen soldier of the French Revolution, that it is the volunteers, who are really motivated and who'll do best of all. So what made the US volunteers sort of like what put them at the bottom rung of, military ability or effectiveness?
That's a good question. I never really quite thought about it that way. But the way I would describe this as is that they didn't sign up to work, and that meant they were not inclined to take training very seriously, and they were not inclined to take discipline seriously at all. And in both of these cases, they were thinking that sort of raw courage and motivation was going to help them in battle. Under these experiences of this you got to think of this enormously, incredibly loud cacophony of battle with people dying all around you and people shouting incomprehensible orders. What really mattered was to stick with your people, right? And to try to follow those orders as opposed to whether you could see anything and shoot at anything. And under those circumstances, American volunteers tended to crumple in ways that the other three kinds of soldiers did not.
Right. Maybe I want to move a little bit away from at this point from the battles themselves and from the armies and talk a little bit about the political comparison of the United States and Mexico in the 1840s. And again, this is a common idea, right? That the United States actually in part may have won the war because it was politically more cohesive, more coherent than Mexico. And in Mexico, actually, at the time that the war was going on, or just before, on the eve of war, and while the war was going on, there were these, little military revolts leading to changes of government. And as you point out in your book, actually, affecting probably the way that the war played out. So in late 1845, a US general who was sent from San Luis Potosí towards the north to reinforce Mexican troops defending the border against the United States at a time when the United States were sort of amassing troops on their side, or what they thought of as their side of the border. This general, Mariano Paredes y Arriaga, with, I think you say 12,000 troops or something like that, decided that instead of marching north to reinforce troops there, he would actually march on Mexico City to make himself president, right? And this is the sort of dysfunction, or what scholars sometimes describe as anarchy in Mexican political life, that has made it very attractive to say that it was this dysfunction that really killed the Mexican war effort. Could you actually maybe start by talking about what was going on with Mariano Paredes y Arriaga? Why did he feel that he wanted to overthrow the president at the time? And what effect do you think did this disunity have on the Mexican war effort?
So there are two things that are going on with Mariano Paredes y Arriaga. First of all, it's never a single individual who, makes this kind of thing happen. Okay. In fact, he built a kind of coalition. Okay. And the coalition he built was a coalition that you could think of itself as probably would think of itself as the coalition against anarchy. And by anarchy, they were very worried about the degree to which relatively Mexicans of very humble degree, of very humble means, were starting to get involved in politics again at the end of the long centralist period. Okay. So they thought of themselves as being the guardians of order in a lot of ways. Now, Paredes himself was an extraordinarily ambitious man who was not nearly as intelligent as he thought he was, but he thought that the Americans were bluffing. Okay, he did not believe there was a real threat on the border, and this is what allowed him to convince himself that he had to save Mexico from anarchy, and that meant marching south rather than north. Okay, he was wrong probably on both counts, and it did have a very large impact on how the war opened, because in the first battles of the war that were fought, on the border between what is now Texas and what is now Mexico, it would have really made a difference to have some of those troops there. It really would have been a check on the Americans, on the American ambitions, and might have led to Mexican victories in those first couple of battles. And maybe that would have meant that Polk would have backed off. On the other hand, maybe it wouldn't have meant that Polk would have backed off, because when Polk actually, after the first had happened and before he knew about them, before he knew the first real battle had happened, when he went to Congress to get authorization for war against Mexico and the recruitment of large numbers of volunteer troops, he did it based on the argument that the American army in southern Texas was in danger, not that they were winning, but that they were in danger. So it's possible that major defeats of the American army in southern Texas at that point would have only increased Polk's desire and the ire of American congresspeople and congressmen back then to have a war against Mexico. Right. At some point, you get into so many hypotheticals that you're almost like writing alternative history when you think about them.
Yeah.
It makes me a little uncomfortable. It's very interesting, but it does make me a little uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah, I was wondering whether I wanted to ask you the question, like what would have been different in Mexican history after the war if Mexico had not lost all that territory? But then I thought that was taking us into terrain that is too speculative. I want to ask you one final question before turning it over to the audience. I wanted to ask you why the Mexican government at some point early during the war, decided to give the command of the army to perhaps the most famous Mexican politician in general at the time, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who at the outbreak of the war, right, he was in exile in Cuba. It was a time when, when he was out of grace in Mexico. And Santa Anna also at that time, when the Mexican-American War happened, had first of all, at least shown himself to not be a reliable winner of battles. He had won some battles, of course, including against foreign invaders, but he has also, lost a very, very crucial campaign in 1835 or 36 in Texas. And Santa Anna also at this time was already quite reviled by part of the population, right? Sort of that history about his artificial leg that, crops up in 100 history textbooks, that had already happened. In other words, he had lost his leg. He, in battle, he had first buried it on his own hacienda in Veracruz. Then in, I think 1842, he had disinterred it, taken it to Mexico City, where he was president, had it reinterred in a Mexico City cemetery in front of foreign dignitaries with sort of like, all the the pomp of state. And then a few years after that, when he fell out of grace, when he left Mexico City to sort of like, put down an uprising in Western Mexico, actually people of humble background, people he might refer to as the rabble of Mexico City, had dug up his leg and sort of like dragged it through the Mexico City streets to general, cheering and rejoicing. And so this is the man, this is, the man with that history who the Mexican government at some point entrusts with leading the Mexican war effort. Why?
So to summarize, there's two basic reasons. One is political and the other one is military. The political reason has to do with the fact that this coalition of opponents of Paredes, who were just talking about Paredes, right, needed to get him out. Okay, and civilian federalists and federalists who were military politicians in different regional areas of Mexico knew they did not have everything they needed to get him out. They did not have the degree of military support they would need to get rid of this guy. And they needed another ally. And what Santa Anna had was he had all these contacts with military units across Mexico and political connections. Okay. And so they needed him. Okay. Even to get rid of Paredes, they needed him. Okay. They also needed him for another reason, which was already by then, he had this reputation as being the guy who could put armies together and could best equip them and best feed them. And again, he had this vast array of contacts, a lot of persuasive ability, often manifested in writing, to get people to give him resources of different kinds. Okay, and he'd already done that repeatedly before 1846. He'd done that, again and again and again. Okay, and they knew this is something that they absolutely needed under these. The problem was the problem of resources. How are you going to get resources? Who's the person who's going to best be able to pull together resources for the war effort? And it's this guy Santa Anna. Now, in practice, in terms of winning battles, he's an average tactician by Napoleonic era standards. He's not terrible. He's not great either. Like most generals, he thinks he's smarter than he is. Okay, but he makes more generally pretty reasonable tactical choices, but no brilliant ones. No, absolutely no brilliant ones. Okay. But in practice, this other side of his generalship, which is his ability to literally put together an army where an army doesn't exist before, is extraordinarily important in the Mexican war effort because he keeps doing it. He's able to keep doing it. Okay. He puts together an army we just talked about that begins at San Luis Potosí and goes to the Battle of Buena Vista. After that army is gone, and it's pretty much is gone by the end of that campaign, he puts together another army to oppose the American invasion through Veracruz, and that loses the Battle of Cerro Gordo and Veracruz right outside Jalapa. Okay, and then after that army is gone, he puts together another army to defend Mexico City. Without him, none of these three things happen, and the war is over many months before it actually ends. Okay. Yes, he's politically unreliable, and he does end up stabbing his allies in the back, right? But in terms of carrying on this war effort the way that it was carried out, without him, it doesn't happen. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
All right, Peter, thank you so much for answering my questions. I have a list of many more, but I'm going to not monopolize this conversation. I'm going to hand it over now to Eduardo, who's going to take audience questions.
Well, thank you very much, Timo and Pizza, for this very fascinating tertulia and discussion about an episode that certainly changed the destiny of the Americas to an extent that is probably unimaginable today. We are taking questions in the usual way. So you could either send a chat note saying that you want to ask the question, or basically just use your hand device. There are already a couple of questions, and I'll